Welcome to the London Commercial Offices podcast with me, your host, Steve Berridge, Managing Director at Fidgens Cost Management. This is a podcast where we share the stories, career paths, lessons and insights from some of the industry's most influential people. Anything contained within our podcast should not be considered professional advice, and if you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe or follow buttons to ensure you don't miss any of the amazing guests we've got coming up. It also really helps us grow the show. Thanks. Today we're joined by Matt Jackson, co-lead of interiors at Hawkins Brown, a global architecture firm with offices in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, Dublin and Toronto. Matt has been in the interior space for some 30 years, with our paths originally crossing back in 2011 when he was design director at Gensler. So without further ado, Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me on the pod. I've listened to many of them, so I'm keen to have a conversation. Lots to talk about.
You'll know from previous episodes that we like to start right back at the beginning, and that varies from guest to guest. So how far back would you like to go today?
Why don't we go right back to school for me, and
Good for
back
me.
to suburban Berkshire. So that's probably where it. I went to school in a place called Twyford, which is in Berkshire, and it's a commuter world in the 80s. So lots of dads, including my own, getting on buses and trains every day up to central London. My dad actually was a nuclear scientist, so he had quite a full-on job actually in London, working with power stations and submarines, all sorts of different types of nuclear elements at the moment. And my mum was a history teacher, so she was also very academic. So I think they had high expectations for me, and I've sort of probably went through school doing all right, but not really ever sort of focusing on the things they probably wanted me to do, like being a lawyer or being an accountant or some of the high value, high academic subjects. I was always more interested in graphic design. I was more interested in CDT and art and those sort of subjects. I did okay in all the humanities and sciences, and I left with a fair amount of O levels at the time. But I always knew I was creative, and I probably wanted to do something that was creative driven. But I don't know whether I had really much direction at school as far as what the opportunities were for someone like, whether you were going to go and do architecture or interior design or graphic design. I knew that when I was a teenager.
There was no real estate kind of background in terms of parents or friends, no exposure to real estate at that point in time.
Not really. My dad's brother was a quantity surveyor, and he had his own practice similar to you, Steve, and he had a successful business down in Southampton. So I always had long, meaningful conversations with my uncle, and he worked on some really interesting, big projects down that way for the University of Southampton and big commercial buildings. So I kind of always had lots of admiration, but I probably knew that I was never good enough with numbers to sort of do that side of construction. But at that time, I was probably more concerned with being a teenager and maybe what was influencing me a little bit towards design was probably music and actually things like record covers and all the graphic design that went into record covers. Factory records I was a big fan of all of the stuff that came out of factory records that Peter Savile had designed. There was another famous graphic designer called Neville Brody, and labels like Mute Records and I think that probably that made me sort of almost want to try and do graphic design, but then I couldn't make a decision. And then I decided that the next step after school was probably going to try and do a foundation course to sort of really steer me on which area of design or the arts it would be. So I headed off to Maidenhead. That was my next stop. And Maidenhead was, I went to the Berkshire College of Art and Design, and I was there for 5 years in the end. So I did a foundation course to start with, and then that led to me really doing a further 4 years of 3D design, which specialized in interior design. I think I just sort of got more and more involved with interior spaces. The course leaders there were very, very interesting people. They were good designers in their own right. We had lots of really interesting, very influential visiting lecturers. And it was exciting times, I think, for interior design. So there was lots of things that stemmed out of some of the factory record stuff, and that included people like Ben Kelly. Ben Kelly was a very influential interior designer of the 80s and then coming into the 90s, and even now he's working. But that period of design was quite an acceptance, I think, on a lot of sort of industrial influence into design, which has always been something that I've always found resonates closely with me. But there was lots of other, amazing interior designers at that time, Nigel Coates, Philippe Stark, lots of people that were sort of, again, making big waves. And it's interesting because interior design is not something that historically has had a huge amount of spotlight on it. You probably can count the most, the 10 most famous interior designers quite easily, but you'd struggle. I mean, with architecture, it's much easier. There's lots of big names in architecture you recognise, all the the big influences, the talisman British architects that have carried architecture all over the world. With interior design, it's a much more smaller industry. So you had to kind of when someone was really spotlighted on, they were, it was a real big deal. So we had some amazing tutors, and through those 4 years at college, we did really well. In terms of development, I think I found myself as my own character. I think I sort of found something that I wanted to really work hard at. So instead of not coasting through being a teenager, it was the next stage where actually, okay, I've plugged into this world, and I really am enjoying it. Got a lot out of it, and ended up towards the end of college winning an award for the Royal Society of Arts, the Student Design Awards. And it's funny how many other people I come across in industry who have won one of the RSA Student Awards, and they are now a fellow of the RSA, which again, that's one of the things that you take through your career. And then it also is something that it took me off to Barcelona for a summer. They gave me a travel bursary, and I had experience in working in the sort of the post Olympics Barcelona, which was amazing at that time because they'd redeveloped the whole city for the Olympics. And afterwards, it was just it was an architectural masterpiece. There were so many new buildings everywhere, so very influential. And I worked with a small practice over there.
And at that time, was that interiors, across every sector? Was it workplace focused? Was it sort of resi focused, or was it just design in general?
Well, the stuff we did, most of the stuff I did at college, it was interesting because it was a lot of it was very hospitality led,
Okay.
and we bars, restaurants. Sometimes we designed a museum. The project that I won an award for was for sustainable living, so it was a new system of modular housing, which was really developed, that could be built off-site. So trying to look at new ways of construction, and we had no idea whether it would work or not. But as a concept, it seemed very doable. But it was, it was the course I was in. It was in 3D design, but it did, we had lots of architects on our course who were very much influencing what we did. So it wasn't really, I would say, interior design with, wallpaper and curtains. Not that type of, that sector, not the resi sort of sector. It's much more, commercial spaces. So where I went to in my career, in the end, I almost felt like that sort of slightly hardened side of interior design, helped me to steer me to probably ending up in workplaces. So after I finished college, it was back to my parents' place in Bristol. They had moved down to there. My dad's job had taken him to an area just outside Bristol. So, but I was actually born in Bristol, so it was my hometown, surprisingly, and it was exciting for me because I had to obviously leave all my college friends, and we all, as we all do from uni, we all spread off in different parts of the country. But
so I
getting
went
down
to
to Bristol
for uni.
Did
so
you? Oh, it was
I know it very well.
such a great city. I mean, such a great student city as well. If you go to college down there, they all say to me, it's one of the best in terms of social life. And just as a city, I mean, it's like a big village, really. It's very easy to get round. All the places. So, I got down to Bristol suddenly into heavy recession because it was around the early 90s, 93, I think this was. Spent a long time applying for jobs, couldn't even get a job in design because I was down in Bristol for a start, but it was the few jobs that were available, it was hard competing for them. But eventually something came up, which was a job for a junior designer for BDG in Bristol, and surprisingly enough, there it was, this what felt like an ideal job, and I worked hard to get it. I can't remember how much I got paid, but it was probably just enough for the bus fare and a little bit more each week, because it was very hard times for the industry. And I had worked with a fantastic studio head down there, a lady called Tracy Wild, still going now, but she was really took me under her wing. And I was a kid really, and so much to learn. And back then it was a small studio that, I think at the most we ever had was 10 people. And my job was probably doing almost everything apart from sort of like, all the major client stuff. So I had to stick down all the presentations. Back then it was all cutting things out, sticking things on foam board, and huge
Collaging.
great big portfolios you take along to meetings with all your stuff in it. Very little of it was digital then. Folding drawings, that was something. I was one of the early CAD guys down there, so drawing everything up. But predominantly it was a big design and build business then. I mean, BDG was over 250 people as a business, and it was all over. We had offices in Frankfurt, all over the UK. It was, big scale, and it did large D&B projects all over the country. Sold furniture, did things like shopping centres. It was a very different sort of animal to how it turned out later in life. But it was exciting, and so many people I know worked through BDG in that time that are in the industry, cutting their teeth somewhere in that process. And there were some amazing people inside it running the business at that time. Really, charismatic, interesting people. We did projects for people like, they're all over because we had to jump in cars every day to get to them all. There's nothing, hardly any of it was actually in Bristol. Something was in, we did Central TV in Birmingham. We did a big job for the British Army in Andover, jobs for Royal Mail, did one job for 3i in Bristol, which was exciting. But I was still a young, this was my first 2 years of my career, but it was really fast track. Sometimes that's one thing I did learn as a lesson, that, sometimes in a very small business, the exposure you get to different types of experience is really great. When if you start in a very, very big business, then you probably don't get such accelerated experience in such a wide area of roles. And that was something that I did find, I actually, even though at the time it probably felt quite daunting, I look back on it now and I think, actually, thank you for working me hard, because actually that was something that is a lesson that I took forward, and making use of every quarter of an hour could do something for you, even as a youngster. So, and living in Bristol at that time was amazing. I sharing a flat with a club promoter. He used to, you might know, but he used to run nights at Lakota and a lot of the kind of big club nights all in the area. So it was quite wild, really. I had these amazing days of work, and then the rest of it was a very sort of active social life in all the things that were going on around Bristol. And it was, such a musical city. All the things that were going, not only the obvious things like people like Massive Attack and Portishead and all of those, the big drum and bass scene, all of that stuff that was going on. There was still also a very significant cultural scene that's very interesting. Huge amounts of artists and different types of design. So it's a real epicenter, I think, in the region for for culture. And I found that really interesting. So I was lucky. I had 2 years of working for BDG at that time, but I did know that there was probably limitations of what I could learn, and I was always by then talking to some of my friends in London who'd started working for London practices and talking about the types of projects. And I knew the budgets were very, very different. And probably, even though I was getting great experience, I probably knew that at some point I was going to have to move to London just for those few years. And I always had in mind it was just going to be a few years. And at that time, a lot of other people were going to Hong Kong. So there was a lot of college friends that finished. They disappeared off to get some fast track experience in what was a really busy period in APAC, so particularly Hong Kong and Singapore, where massive design and build markets, but they just needed people that could use all the tools. So
was that a consideration for you in terms of going abroad or not?
It was, yeah, it was it's probably is either going to be out to Hong Kong or London. I knew people that were in Hong Kong, so they did say, I can offer you jobs. And I did actually apply. There was quite a few agencies in London who were running a complete process of getting people jobs in Hong Kong. And I did, I went through an interview process with one, but I probably thought, it would be brave, it would be traveling, and I respect the people that did it, but I knew that probably London would be my obvious choice of where I wanted to go. So there it was. So I made a decision in the end, and I didn't have a job to go to. So I did. One of my friends said, "Oh, we've got a bedroom coming up in a place in where we're all living. Do you want to move up to London now?" And I thought, okay, I'll bite the bullet. Had some savings to sort of pay the rent for a few months, but had to decide what was, quite quickly on whether it was what kind of job I was going to do. Got to London, and it turned into. First of all, I worked on contract for a hospitality design company that did hotels in Dubai. called KCA International, and it was a very interesting, very different to what I did. But they just needed me really as someone who could use MicroStation, which was the drawing package. But I think I stayed there for about 6 months. But all the time I knew that I wanted to try and get a job back in workplace because
In London.
yeah, in London. It was really, I knew that was probably what I could do well, and I'd done projects already, and I knew that that's where my skill base needed to be developed. So even though I had some great fun with the team at KCA and a very, very, very effervescent team, let's put it that way, very, fun and social. I think that's one thing I'd noted actually, the differences between businesses that predominantly do workplace and commercial buildings compared to the businesses that do hospitality and the whole sort of link with places like Chelsea Harbour. And suddenly it was a very different social world just for a little bit of time when I first got to London. But then suddenly the next job was for TTSP. Moved over to them and they were in Clerkenwell. And I was very pleased to get that job. It was, they had, I could straight away relate to the work I was doing, and I could sort of, even though 2 years experience, it was fast track. It was really, I was able to put it into, the work at TTSP quickly. And it's a great little team. I worked with a guy called David Kelly, who's worked with, he worked there for a long time, and he was a very long established. Dave taught me lots of things, which is very, very interesting. Again, so it's really interesting uses of how to make time work well, and lots of very, very good lessons on efficiency at that stage. And I think with TTSP, a lot of the work they did was for big banks. So we had, JP Morgan was a huge client for them, Guardian Royal Exchange. There were others as well. But it was part of also the buzz of being in Clerkenwell. Suddenly I was in the design district, and it was, again, you could do something almost every night. You go and see a showroom or go and see, some sort of event. It was suddenly, I'd never had that in Bristol because it's a little village atmosphere, but suddenly city atmosphere. All these different types of products that I'd never seen in reality, and then all of the various different things through the cycle of the year. Where you'd have
the Christmas parties or the
all those, and on massive scale as well. Suddenly these parties were, I think TTSP at that point was around close to 150 people. So it's quite a big business, and even though BDG was bigger, but it never seemed to be all in one place at the same time. But it was all the other things like Clerkenwell Design Week. There's lots of other things that were specifically there. I think they've grown bigger and bigger, but they were still there in their early days. And it was just, it was very, very exciting to work with them. And a lot of people I took, I worked with in later places in my career as well that were from TTSP. So, and a lot of people that were, I would say, quite, instrumental influences in the industry as well. People like Tim Jennings, quite a few of the early design directors, George Davison. They were great people to work for. And back then it was still a lot of mix of analog, so drawing boards still, and also sketch drawing, so not visualization via computers. People that could sketch really quickly in front of clients and show them that process, which again I really admire that now. And it's a shame we in some ways that's almost been a bit of a lost. It's become a lost art in our world, and it's very strange when suddenly someone shows a hand-drawn sketch. But I long for some more of that really, because I think that some of that is sort of shows super talent, and it explains things to clients very quickly. But I'm certainly not dismissing the way the world's moved forward. The technology has taken its part and been a huge help to us. But I've always admired that sort of talent. But the creative drums, I must admit, the creative drums did carry on banging a little bit, and TTSP had its limitations because it had very conventional clients, and even though a lot of the work was great, the team was great, I still probably wanted to try and find something that was going to maybe be a bit more
out there,
progressive in terms of workplace design, I think. And I think that I didn't really know the market very well, but then I was approached by a recruiter from looking for a job at MCM, and I didn't know much about MCM then, so I did a bit of research, but probably not enough back then because there was no online stuff, so it's just more sort of questions. So, but anyway, I had the interview, and Ken Giannini of all people interviewed me and offered me a job. You probably know Ken, and that was the start of an amazing period of my career, to be honest. I stayed with MCM for 14 years, and it was and at the time when I joined them, they were sort of growing business with a highly creative reputation, based down in the Oval in a funny little lock-up building. It was like a Muse building, but it was it was a startup business in some ways, but it was already established, but it still felt like a startup business. Like, I guess that's a bit of a cliche. Everyone says, "Oh, we want to keep the startup feel forever," but it still had that feel to it. And they just won a big they'd completed a big project for the Ark in Hammersmith. I don't know if you can remember that, but that's C. Graham finished that with the tenants, and they were the first big tenant into that building. In fact, it was developed for them, really. But the fit out, which was done by MCM, and it was a massive coup that they'd won it in the market. I think it had buoyed the business up and suddenly really put them on the map. And I think at the time, Hazel Marsh was the person who was running the business, and Hazel was just a really inspiring leader to suddenly arrive at. I don't think I'd ever come across someone quite like her before. She was incredible. She was very good at talking, amazing salesperson, just had that way of making someone feel very calm, even though she was probably being sort of, trying to sell services and show value. But also she had this incredible side to her that was just so much energy. But one of the things I also learned about Hazel was, and seeing that, was she was a complete defender of her people, in the way that, if there was ever an argument in any situation, contractually or however the relationship was happening, Hazel would be right there protecting people. She would never, first stage, of any sort of like tricky situation, Hazel. So she showed me signs of just being that, that really taking on things. It's her business, and she will defend it to the hilt. But she also had a very just side of her, where I know that she could see also what great design was. So she had a great partner in crime at the time, which was Paul Scrivener. And I think Paul was, of that little era, probably one of the most respected design directors in the industry. And he was probably my mentor for a long period of that time. Very, a real pure design director, hugely into design. I just, I saw him caring about the projects like I probably hadn't seen quite before in my career. He was so hands-on with absolutely everything. And his whole day would just be moving around the studio, just, almost acting as a teacher, but just, steering all the projects, giving people the rope to develop, but also just showing people, from one minute it might be proportion, materiality, it can, color. He was very good with all of these, and all of this led to, I don't know, probably quite a hard experience working with him, because he was hard on you, but he was also at the same time encouraging. But you knew that hardness was the same as like a college tutor was being with you and saying, "Okay, Matt, you're not doing this right. Look at this way of doing it. Explore that way of doing it." He'll give you a book to look at and say, "Right, read this chapter and see, and we'll talk about what you find." And I was very lucky to have people like this in my career to help. Some of the lessons that they taught me. I mean, Paul was very much a advocate of all of these projects are about teams. They're not about rock star individuals. So everyone is playing their part. Matt, you're a young person in this team, but you're playing your part like the person that's presenting to the client, because you're preparing all that work to go to the client. And the other way around, you're valuing everyone's opinion. You can have a working session with a group, and it's not only the sort of director that's going to have the right idea. It might be the junior, because they've got a different way of living their life, and they'll have a different view on using a space. And I always found that sort of, that not necessarily just top down, almost bottom up, in fact, or maybe even completely democratic way of thinking, something that I've always taken forward. I always think that storytelling and narratives are something I really learned a lot of at MCM as well, about how every project can tell a story. You should never let a project just be about a process. It's always got to have something that the client's going to sort of have an anchor or a relationship with, where they can not only tell all their people about, but it's going to, either whether it's the brand, whether it's the building, whether it's something else within that storytelling that is going to sort of leave its mark. And that's, it's a golden part of pitching, having a really strong story and a narrative that you need to convey to the client to make them fall in love with your design or your ideology. But I think that both of those, a lot of the projects we did at MCM had sort of great narratives and the start of storytelling. And I think I probably understood how much that briefing and stage 2, the concept design, are so informative on a large scale project and how they can lead into something. The business was growing at the time. I mean, it was growing at a tremendous speed. Seemed to be taking on lots of people, and eventually we moved out of the Oval and up to Hopton Street, which was up on the South Bank. So it was again, there was not much on the South Bank at that time. The Tate Gallery was being built. There was a few sort of a few significant buildings that were coming up, but it was still quite early doors. Really, there was not many businesses had gone south of the river. It seemed like a little bit of a risk.
It's certainly changed now.
It has, but it was a great little building. They took the whole building, which again was amazing to have this suddenly a landmark sort of destination and we had our own large scale library, and suddenly everyone had machines to sort of to use AutoCAD on, and then that grew and grew, and it suddenly turned into the largest market share of the London commercial fit out market. And I don't know if you remember, Steve, and you're younger than me, I know that, but when years ago before MIPIM, every year they would there used to be an information service called Metropolis, and this used to issue a survey every year of all of the market percentages of all the businesses. And MCM had the largest market share of all of the square footage that was done in fit out over 12 months. I think they had that for 3 years in a row, which was very impressive. So all those other companies, and some of them were still emerging in London, but the other big contenders at that time were people like Swanky, Hayden, Connell, even Orchid, Pringle Brandon. I think TP Bennett were growing at that time, and Gensler was sort of growing at that time. They were there, but they were sort of not a huge business at that time. So it was really interesting. It was a very small business punching above its weight, and I think that I was very chuffed to, well, not, I mean, it's just a very instrumental part of my career. And some of the projects we did, we did Sainsbury's offices, the big project in Holborn, which at that time was 360,000 square feet for a retailer in central London, which was massive. As far as as far as scale goes for someone like Sainsbury's. Then we did Marks and Spencer's offices over in Paddington, which was really, again, another sea change project. It was a real approach, a new approach towards agility and profiling of all their staff, and the workplace strategy that went into actually moving them out of Baker Street up to Paddington was very, very interesting. All the science that went into that, and the convincing, because as quite an old-fashioned business, trying to move them forward into, with it, again, a very sophisticated change management process. It was everything coming together. So these sort of projects, when you do move a lot of people out of it, when they've been used to several older buildings, and then suddenly a very new style of working, and even the discussions about people moving out of offices, which was almost unheard of, senior management like Stuart Rose and those sort of people that were running Marks and Spencer at the time. But it was a very successful project, and same again with some of the law firm projects we did. Norton Rose was a big project on the South Bank. Projects for Fitch Ratings, the Prudential, Hutchison Whampoa, working with kind of big brands, and that was really a great experience as well, understanding brands, and working with some amazing brand consultants actually, on some of these projects, because they've all got them. People like we worked with 2020 on Sainsbury's, and such a big public brand, and then Lipper Pierce with Dominic Lipper on Marks and Spencer's, which again was great, because these were all sort of like really prominent graphic designers of their time, people that really understand typology.
Kind of what actually got you interested.
Really exciting for me to work with these sort of people that and how we could have this final touch on projects that just had this sharp brand awareness and delivery of message, and often on these projects, my design ethos was always keeping them very simple. They sort of always worked on sort of simple geometry, quite raw, where we could take them to that type of language if the client would be prepared to let us push them in that direction. But all very, very exciting. MCM went for a lot of sustainability focus at that time, so we were driving towards, I think everyone in the market at that time, it was one of those areas where everyone suddenly had to jump on sustainability. And I don't know if you can recall that time, but it was, some of these certification systems weren't up and running yet properly. They were still very new. but everyone was trying to steal a march on each other from having the best sustainability, intent at that time, and rightly so. So it was good. It was good to be part of that. And then we did win a lot of awards. We had we had some amazing teams on these projects, and I just continuously was learning. Every project taught me something, and it was very, very lucky to have that new levels of responsibility. So I was kind of growing in responsibility. But I left as a design director when I finally left MCM, but it was a very hard decision. I don't know if you've ever been with a business for a long time, but 14 years, these people become like your everyday. I mean, I was seeing these people more than I was my wife in a week, and spending more time every day with all of your everyday people that you work very hard with to deliver fantastic work, and you trust each other in the same way that you would sort of almost trust your family. So it was very hard to move on, but I got to a stage with it where the business was probably looking for next generation of management, but it was very difficult to sort of work out how that was really going to happen. And I probably thought, okay, I'm gonna see how it works somewhere else. I might, it might be something that maybe return back there one day. You never know, but it was never
It's a very
something that
small
I
market.
counted on.
As we say on every
It is.
pod, it's a very small market. And you're talking about TTSP, and I've worked with TTSP for a long time. And again, it was only a couple of years ago that they came back around on the map for us, and we were working with them again, different people, but same business. Interesting. When we started the conversation, obviously you were in Bristol, and you kind of said that you knew you wanted to go to London for a couple of years. I was curious as to kind of at what point in over those first couple of years, did you make a definitive mindset shift that actually I'm here now for good, or had you always planned to to move, either go back to Bristol or to go abroad?
I think that once I got to London and I'd got into the sort of into the industry speed of it all, and realizing what the value of it was, I probably realized, okay, it's going to be 10 years here. Yeah, and I'm going to accept it, and maybe going back to another city, and I still really like Manchester as well. That was another place I always had as a sort of potential place to live, but I was settled enough, and it was probably off my mind by then to think, actually, I'm not going to go. MCM did almost all their work in London. There was very little of it that was really around the country. There was a few things, but so I could go and see all these projects as they were being built. And it's unlike probably getting to other businesses later where it was not easy to go and see a project. I mean, for instance, on Sainsbury's, I was on site there practically all the time for almost 9 months when it was being built, and that time of actually being on site, working with contractors, drawing things through, being site reactive was again incredible experience for me. And anyone really at that age. I mean, you undervalue. I often think that when you're working in a business that's doing continuously overseas projects from London, it must be quite hard for those juniors or middleweights or that are coming up in the ranks to say confidently how something's going to be working on site, because they won't have had that experience. And I think that's the sort of thing that if you do work for a business that has a lot of local projects where you can be involved in seeing a site develop and construction develop, it does pay a lot back. I think one thing that we had at MCM was a very good system of really earning your stripes. So when the titles that we have in our industry, and a lot of people are very obsessed with the titles because they see it as a sign of development and status almost. But the way that MCM worked was that you really would not be promoted until you really understood what you were doing. You can't really, just because you've got a certain amount of years experience, that doesn't mean that you're entitled to be promoted, so they made you really understand, okay, this is what the job needs you to do. And I think that that was very, being a senior designer at MCM was a very serious job.
I think that's a really important point, and I'm not sure whether it's whether it's in across different sectors or different professions, or maybe it's just a sign of the times. But I think that's a completely different approach now across most of the industry in terms of what we see. Almost titles become a kind of a a talent retention mechanism almost, in the sense of, so and so's been here for X years, they're now chartered, therefore they become an SPS, and they're there for another 2 years, and then they get a job offer somewhere else, and in order to retain them, we'll give them a promotion. And what that means actually is, you could be bumping into a senior associate or even a director that actually might have only been in the industry for 7 years, 8 years.
I know.
And that's not to say that they're not very good, but that there's a lot to be said for just time and, as you said, earning your stripes.
Yeah, I think I've always valued that. I mean, I think sometimes the word director it can be misused a little bit. I mean, years ago, when a director was someone who probably was someone who owned a business, and actually was someone at Companies House, and it's slowly sort of become further and further down the line as the role, what it actually means. But I certainly never disregard talent, because talent can be at all sort of ages and experience, and people are sometimes super capable very early in their careers. But it is something I've always been wary of when sometimes I've had people applying for jobs, and I've thought, I'm not sure whether you're really. I don't want to put you in this level of responsibility yet, because I don't. You need more experience to really take that that risk, and it's risk for me as well if I'm putting you into a very, say, difficult project team that's got a very hard demand on it, to put you into someone as a senior designer who's going to have to run different types of meetings or whatever it might be, and record it and be able to speak competently against a whole room of professionals. Sometimes that's a lot for a youngster.
Absolutely.
So I think that needs, that, not that took me probably a long time to get to that as well, because I know there would have been many meetings when I would have been in thinking, crikey, I've got to really know my stuff here, and and actually I maybe don't know my stuff well enough in all these situations. So I'm lucky I've got an amazing. Yeah.
I think there's people need to be put into scenarios that are slightly outside of their comfort zone to stretch them and to enable them to grow. But but it's got to be done, I think, in a controlled way, for both to protect the business, but also to protect that individual, so that they can enjoy their role and enjoy their growth, rather than constantly feeling like they're underwater. And it's I can imagine that's a tricky line.
I think a bit of deep water can be good, though. I think that a bit of deep water, as long as you've got a really good person behind you, is a good thing. But you just need to make sure that you've got someone that's prepared to help you and say, okay, this is how you do this, Matt, because I don't know how to do this, I don't know how to record this, I don't know what to expect. And those are there's life lessons that I'm lucky to have had a lot of those with great people that have supported me. So anyway, next stop after MCM was Gensler.
So where did that come from in terms of that opportunity? Was that back out to market in terms of recruitment agents, or was that an existing relationship that you'd formed? Talk to me about that role.
It was an interesting one, because I was a design director, and I wanted to do more design, and it's a hard role to find when you've sort of got the amount of experience I had then, which was coming up to 20 years. And I just did not. You don't know who's going to be looking for that sort of role, because not everyone. Some companies didn't even have one design director. They were like TP Bennett don't have design directors, for instance. But I did take myself back out to the recruitment market, and started talking ADRIM back then with the agents, and suddenly something came up with Gensler, and I knew a few people who'd gone over to Gensler over the years, but I didn't know much about them. They had a very high reputation by that point. They was starting to sort of get some market share in London and gain responsible projects, like Clifford Chance, for instance, was one of those that had put them on the map again, but along with a lot of the American banks in London. I met up with a guy called Simon Jackson, who was one of the principals at that time. Great guy, actually. Straight away, resonated with him for lots of reasons. I thought, and a lot of the other people that I've worked with in the past, people like Katrina Kosik-Salmon, she was ex-Gensler, but she'd worked with Simon, and a lot of the principals around that time. Kim Burt was another person who I'd known from BDG. So I thought, that from my first few impressions of going in there, it was very interesting, and I thought, this is a well-organized business. It was big, it's about 250 people, so it's a big step up from scale-wise from MCM. I eventually, I think it was the third interview I went in. I was meeting Enrico Caruso and Simon again, to discuss and show them my portfolio. And then next thing I know, Simon told me, well, actually, Matt, we David Gensler's in town and he'd like to come in and meet you. And this was it was the global CEO at the time, and I thought, oh crikey! And again, I whether I felt confident about presenting or not, I don't know. But he came in, and again, he was a really, really warm guy, and I think that I probably made my decision by the end of that meeting that I thought, okay, if they offer me a job, I'd love to work for them because it'll be a very good experience for me. It was a contrast to MCM, but it would be interesting, and their aspirations towards design. They already had an amazing, set of design directors at Gensler, but I was just joining the whole charge forward on where they were going. Interesting to work for the business of scale at that point. I mean, I think there were about 5,000 people globally, but it was incredible. If you just look at the amount of revenue a business like that turns around, and that's one of the biggest things I learned very quickly was probably a lot more about the commercial side of design and how a business like Gensler makes money, about the focus on margin, the focus on how is this business going to not just make money, but also perform really well for that. So the incredible width of research and data that Gensler has, which is global, and it's a huge amount of money that's put back into the overall profit pot, which is spent back on research. So I don't know what the percentage was, but again, from that, the overall global revenue, there's a huge amount of money that goes back into research, and that goes to everyone. So you can all access this huge pool of data. And that's hugely interesting. I'd never seen anything like it. It was like I wouldn't say Wikipedia was the right word, but it was literally you could cut this data in so many ways and use it to show trends, what's happening in all regions, and in all different workplace sectors. So I found that I joined global groups for different types of focus areas, including professional service firms, where I was on the global leaders for that, which again was amazing, working with all these people with different perspectives. And I think that for me was just that was one of the biggest gains I had from it. I worked with a great strategist called Matthew Kobilar, who was really incredible workplace strategist, who just with some of the projects we did with him for Nokia and Aon were both some of the widest sweeping strategy processes I've ever seen, with the biggest amount of outputs, but the data that convinced the client to sort of move quite radically in a new direction was amazing. And I think the Gensler Toolbox was, again, developing, but very, very impressive. And I always thought the outputs were some of the best I've seen in my career for strategy. And then also worked with Gary Peters, and Gary was a long-term Gensler person who was a great project director. Worked with him on Aon, and again, a very challenging project to work on. But he showed me lessons as well, lots of things about how to do process and how to handle situations. Being tough, probably. I think that was a big lesson. Learning where to be tough in a very difficult situation, defending the design. Don't let things get watered down. Stick to your principles.
And is that as in from a client perspective? Don't let the client water down the design, or is that downstream?
Well, it was probably cost driven elements that we probably had to be making.
Don't let the QS dilute your design.
Well, actually, on that particular project for Aon, we had a guy called Steve Stedman, who was actually he was an ex-QS by trade, but also our client. So he was very aware on the costs, and he was also great to work with. So we had a number of different people who were cost savvy, but we were just trying to, the project had high aspirations, and it had to look very, very strong, because it was, again, it was a big significant move for Aon, and it was in the brand new in 122 Leadenhall Street, so it was right opposite Lloyd's. So there was lots of things that needed to be almost a statement, but also the big thing was really just transforming the way they work. And Katrina also worked on this project with us as well, doing some of the initial setting some of the brief for us. So very interesting. We also did some other great work with GSK. That was another big client while I was at Gensler. Lots of legal projects for US lawyers in London, which was good to work with. Again, they often didn't have quite as much progressive thinking, but there was always a margin that we could take them. There was always somewhere where we could say, look, the London market is doing this. This is what the legal sector, has made great steps forward with. Would you consider this, even though they might be a very cellular lawyer based in Kansas or somewhere in the States? So it's there was always some progress to make with every client. And I've always made sure that you can't take everyone on a giant journey from leaping from one place to another, but many you can just push them forward to their comfort level to say that you are making progress. You have made a big change on this project, because half these projects they're once every 10 years, once every 5 years, sometimes once every 25 years, and when a lease is that long, people don't want to be refitting. So I've always thought timeless, but really make it effective. Two things that I've taken forward. I also think that in the world of work in Gensler, so this is pre-COVID. One other thing that was very important was the rise of collaboration. I mean, that word, it's been a buzzword for years. It's just probably a bit overused, but collaboration and agility and activity-based working, they were the sort of some of the big words around that time. And continually, I guess ABW is something that has been around longer, but I think it's a bit of a Frank Duffy term actually from DGW. But they were the things that were getting a lot of attention on workplaces having a lot more collaborative settings, starting to really actively introduce, with technology as well, desk sharing, a lot more mobility in offices. We were hitting the big rise of mobility, so people moving around when they're working and not tethered to desks all day. And that again was very interesting. So a lot of these projects had the real ability to sort of bring that into the strategy of how they would work and change. And Gensler just had a great toolbox to work with. They did fantastic, workplace strategy offer, and they also had one very interesting survey that was global. It's called the Gensler Workplace Index. It really was an incredible survey done every year, all their existing clients globally, and that snowballed every year with new clients joining. And I don't know how many years that would be running for, but it probably about 20 years of data on workplace trends and how things have moved. And there are other big surveys in the market like Leesman. There are others. I think CBRE do a big sort of workplace survey in the United States. But the Gensler one is that amount of data, what you can produce out of that data is incredible. So anyway, I've sung Gensler's praises a lot here. So we're now going to move on.
So how long, in terms of time, were you with Gensler for?
It was just under 7 years. It felt like we got a lot done in 7 years, and it was difficult to move on again from Gensler because it's a great culture in terms of people. It's very together business, lots of great social stuff, and circular supportive. Really, when there's a problem project, then you suddenly have several people ready to help you out. And I think that's quite admirable in a business. And when you're inside this business, it's talk about the big G and this sort of global family, and there is a bit of that there. And I think when any business gets to a huge scale, it becomes a corporation like that. But it does. There's still every single location, I think, has a lot of togetherness inside it, which is very admirable. So I enjoyed my time there, and I learned a lot. Is a contrast from where I was before. And I did actually. I was persuaded to go and work by one of my ex-colleagues who'd moved over to a small business called AFK, Arnie Fender Casalicis, over in Shoreditch, led by Earl Arnie, who was ex-Woods Bagot, and a very charismatic leader, I might add. Actually, I thought Earl was a great guy, standing up, rallying the troops, and good speaker. I think it was probably too much of a contrast moving to a business which was relatively a startup from the sophistication of Gensler. And I probably just found that time, okay, I probably need to go back to someone that's probably a little bit more focused on workplace rather than commercial buildings. But I still count those 6 months that I had with them as being great fun and another lesson learnt in certain ways. Anyway, our next stop was BDG, so full circle really, back to BDG, and I kind of probably didn't necessarily expect it. I kind of left AFK with nothing to go to, and I just sort of was, talking to different people in the market. You're like me, Steve. You know all your competitors. All your, they're all people you know well enough. You're in the market with them, and I've always believed very strongly about having full respect for everyone around you in terms of competitors, because one day they'll want a job.
It's such a small such a small market, London. I know London's a big place, but if you look at London workplace, London fit out, it is it's everybody does know everybody, which is part of the reason why I love it.
Yeah. And you see all these people at pitches, you see them all at the BCO events, you see them all at conferences and things. So you're continuously having dialogue. And I've always, I think there's good things to learn from being open with your competitors. You're not going to give them away all your IP, but you can talk to them, about how industry things are happening, your industry movement, certain trends. And I think that's always useful conversation. So I did talk to a few people, but I ended up, taking a decision to come back to BDG. BDG again was a really interesting business at that time, and it still is now. But it was very much moving in a sort of direction of growth. It was in the middle of a huge WPP campus program, which was global, and that was taking it all over the world, doing projects, in many major cities all over Europe, and it turned out to also be APAC and the US. I wasn't really brought in to sort of focus on that, although I did work on one big project, but I was really there to try and look at how we can find new revenue streams outside that particular process of work, because that was from the parent group and it was a dominant revenue stream within BDG. So we were looking at how do we diversify a little bit. I think they knew I probably had quite a strong network, and I've always made a point of a network. I probably just said a little bit, but half my time is spent sort of talking to people, PMs, QSs, all different types about what's going on, because we all need to understand what is there, and networks take a long time to develop. You've got to build up trust and understanding, and people have got to understand what you offer, not just as a personality as well as a business offering. So but yeah, joining BDG was great, really interesting. It was a great team of creatives, very creative business, in fact, really creative output, lots of good creative directors of different parts, amazing strategists as well, who had different ways of doing it that I'd seen. So again, it was another sort of type of how visualizing the strategy outputs, showing it as a lot more focus on data and actually what that data looks like, how it's cut. So there's some really good science going on here, and I thought, okay, this is again another interesting thing. I can bring things that I've learned, but again, I can learn more, and we can maybe even turn these into another evolution of things. And that was so we had amazing couple of years of projects were starting, and then suddenly pandemic hit, which was it threw everyone. We had a lot of big projects on site. Some of them in Europe, and then some in London. But it did throw it threw everyone, really, didn't it? I mean, it was a sort of sea change in society. But but I've got some views on it, and I do feel certainly in the UK, obviously it was terrible that there was such a loss of life and suffering, and massively affected families, and I think that not only people that died, people that had long COVID and suffered for long periods of time after it. It's still scars of it now all over the place. That you feel, and even now when you're getting on the train, there's people sneezing. You think, oh, COVID's back, or we just learned how to deal with COVID because it's become a little bit more accepted, and we're all tolerant to it. But I do think that if you look back on it, I think that it was probably the fastest acceleration of workplace change in a really short space of time. It was almost like the global pilot study on remote working. The whole world did it. Everyone. It wasn't just an office. It was everyone in society. It was almost the biggest test on trust ever. All of that sort of those questions that were there about whether people can be trusted to work at home at all levels. I'm talking, directors and senior people, you'd probably expect that, but can the juniors or the sort of people that have just graduates and things. But that's been it was also one other thing, that it was 3 months in the first lockdown, and I don't know where you were based in that time, Steve, but it was glorious sunshine every day, and we had 3 months of everyone waking up with their families. I had 2 kids at home trying to school them and doing the homeworking stuff with them, but also trying to keep your job and working hard and doing long days, in fact. But suddenly it was glorious weather in the morning. You get up in the morning, I could go for a quick jog, and then I can start work. And then uh, but you were generally working sort of like 9-hour days every day because you were keeping up with the work, but you wanted to show how busy you were. You were doing so much fast networking. You were talking, trying to find out. There was a distinct risk of recession there, but that was combining with this other big societal change of people being at home around their families, working, glorious sunshine. And it was I think those 3 months almost changed the world of white collar working. I think that
Completely agree.
they changed the acceptance of what a day's worth of work is, because
And
we are
you
now
said
in
it. You said the
2020.
point.
Sorry.
It was no, that's okay. It was it was a big accelerated acid test of a new way of working, and I wonder, as you said, COVID terrible, but taking the positives out of it. Had that not happened, I don't know whether or not we would have adopted ever a new way of working. I think, look, some companies were looking at it and were, but they, a very, very small percentage. And for that large scale adoption, there would never have been the impetus to make that happen. And you said, I do think back, it was when we had our first child during that period of time, and exactly the same. It was sunshine. It was a nice walk in the morning. It was doing, trying to do more work to remove that anxiety around what's going on in the world. So you're overworking, partly to demonstrate to your peers and your colleagues that you are working, but partly to kind of because there was too much unknown. But you were doing that, sat next to your partner at home who was also doing the same. And it's almost once you've tasted that, the writing was on the wall for traditional ways of working. It could never, I don't think, go back to how it was.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it did. It stamped that change that's never really been capable of going back from. And even though there's constant return to works, and I think people mandating sort of 5 days back in the office, it's still I think it's something that's very difficult to change from, because and the people that are the younger generation that have come through university and done almost all of their university work through understanding working remotely and effectively working remotely and thinking almost that's the norm now, this is how the world of work is, that you don't need to be
They've never
in a
known any
workplace
different.
all the time. Exactly that. And I think
it's
that's
kind of
something
like
that
people that started their career before the internet.
Mm.
The next generations come through. We thought, it's I saw a video a little while ago. It was handing a child a tape and a pencil, and it was just them looking at it blankly because they had no concept about trying to rewind a tape using a pencil. You just don't know that, and I think it's in my opinion, it's for the better. It's there's still a case to have people in an office, undoubtedly, and this has been debated to death on LinkedIn. Return to work and the benefits and the pros and cons. And I think, look, it's got to be a case by case and business by business and sector by sector.
Yeah, and I think that I just do think there's been a societal change that has probably made everything. There is lots of positives that are within a lot more flexibility in working, and I think what you just said beforehand, if COVID hadn't happened, would everyone really be going in 5 days a week, and the odd day if you're working from home would be only if you're having a washing machine fitted or something like that. It wouldn't be just I'm working from home today, no reason for it, I just fancy it. But I think it's really interesting, and I think that the acceptance to go back to some sort of change that would enforce it. And I know big corporations have tried to enforce it. I'm still wondering what the results are going to be, because if you think of all the other things that are quite interesting. So there was a lot of rash predictions around the time of COVID of what's going to happen. The fall downing of the office. There's no more need for commercial buildings. We're all suddenly going to be in, there's going to be the spoken wheel scenarios that everyone was talking about. Lots of different. Everyone was trying to define what was the post-COVID workplace would be, or the strategy around it, around working.
But I think part of that was a coping mechanism. It provided people comfort to help and to publish, to provide predictions about, it's going to be fine, guys, and we're going to work in this new way. And I think part of that was just coping. That was just trying to remove, their own, worries about what the future was. And I think it's the whole the benefit now. And yes, you have some businesses that are mandating, 5 days a week staff in their office, and I think, and that's fine. But the downsides of that is that geographically significantly restricts your talent pool. So that means that, if you want your guys in a London office 5 days a week, that's fine. But that means that your talent pool really needs to live within an hour of central London. And that's fine.
Agree.
The issue is that your competitors, if they take a different approach and are more flexible, actually have access to a global talent pool. And I think over time, that's going to be the difference. You'll see businesses that potentially are restricted in terms of talent versus ones that have access to the entire globe. And I think over time, those are the businesses that are going to potentially succeed at perhaps a faster level than more traditional models.
I think that's a really good point. That's a really good point. I'll take that away from this. I think that's a really good point. I think that also there was a very, everyone made a lot of rash predictions about what's going to happen, and sometimes some very rash mandates on their staff and bold predictions. I mean, we saw one of our clients actually at BDG reduced so radically to taking almost a quarter of their workspace from what they had, and said we want people to be in 1 day a week. And I thought that was incredibly radical. But that space was always packed. Whenever you'd go in, it was just almost utilized to 80% all the time. So that was a massive benefit, and that was a business that just totally could operate like that. But they just, they always had the opportunity to have everyone together socially when needed. And I think that's one thing that there has been a little bit of tail wagging the dog, and many people would say it's become more the people over employers that actually are dictating the flow and the direction of it all, because a lot of it is, when there is a sort of big statement around 5 days a week in, that seems huge shockwaves everywhere, and then there's a resistance curve to that, and it turns into something that's slightly different for some anyway, not all. But so I think that I find it quite interesting. I think that the people power in the world of work now has been very interesting to sort of see how that's developed. And I think that actually the settling period that we've had over the last 2 years, we've got back down to relatively consistent travel patterns. We've still got Fridays, which are sort of empty in a lot of cities, and I think London's actually becoming a good city for utilization, but there's still some cities that are still vastly underpopulated from workforces in Mondays and Fridays. But I think that the life elements and the people needs. So there's still the things about wanting to sort of have time of families and cycle routines with children, things like that, whatever it might be in your life. I think those are things that businesses do take quite seriously, and that flexibility is something that's come into the modern acceptance now, which is actually a very positive thing. We haven't really had a really heavy recession yet, which is what would probably change things and change the level of presenteeism, maybe, but maybe not, because there is still there's still a full argument to say, look, I'm doing my job remotely really, really well. So, I want to be with everyone. I'm going to be with them 3 or 4 days a week, but it's not, it's maybe the actual demand can be managed. So let's go on then. So with in that time, technology went crazy. I mean, it was a super fast acceleration. Everyone sort of had to find different ways of meeting and collaborating online. And that 2 years of the overall sort of COVID period was incredibly, surprising to show how quickly technology, and it was also surprising to see how science evolved as well. Even all the vaccine process, that was incredible how fast all those things. So technology, science, lots of areas of innovation moved really, really quickly in that period. But I do think that some of the things that the offices took focus on, like I said, people needs, that took center stage. A lot of the things around social capital, being together when you are together. A lot of the workplaces we did were very focused on big areas of social capital, build, place where people could come in, and it wasn't just about sitting in a workplace all day. It was around, okay, we want you all to work together and be together, whether it was dining, eating, drinking coffee, however, workshopping, whatever it might be. But people also, some of the biggest battles have been is what is going to be better than being at home. So if I want, if I want the same psychological comfort that I've got sitting at home and having all the things around me that I would normally have, like I can open a window, or I can dim a light, or put on different lights, and whatever it might be, is making those sort of things and having that sort of choice. Whether you want to work on your kitchen table, or you work in your home office, or go and sit in the garden and work, because those sort of things, I think those are big lessons that we all learnt in COVID as well. That sort of choice and sort of home agility, and those sort of things, people needed to bring those into the office. So there's quite a few people, I think that Professor Jeremy Myerson has been very instrumental with some fantastic stuff that he's done from the Royal College. And a lot of that has been defining around early definition of psychological comfort and where that was going. Also, well-being, so important. That's become every workplace now is big focus on well-being elements. How that can work. I think the diversity and choice of where you're going to work within a workplace. It's not all necessarily workstations anymore. That's changed. The composition of a lot of offices has, certainly in the last 4 years, it's not all about everyone having a desk anymore. It's about the right space to work. And I think that's great. That's great for designers to sort of be able to put that diversity into workspaces, far more diverse than they were sort of maybe 20 years ago. So, and then, I think it's just probably the fastest track change that we've seen in workplace design, that I could have possibly imagined. And it has been very, very exciting in many ways, just to sort of be part of almost this fast reactive evolution. But as I said, it is a settled period now. There hasn't been a huge amount of change for 2 years now. And when we talk about a lot of, it's constantly spoken about post-pandemic workplace, I think we're past that now. I think the post-pandemic workplace was an era, and I think we're now probably into the next evolution. I don't know what the term's going to be, but I think there needs to be a new term to say, okay, what's the next progressive stage that we're at? We've settled for 2 years broadly. What's going to be the next bit, that we sort of look forward into? And I think there's lots of things that are influencing that right now. So I think that, I don't know whether they're going to influence physical workspace, but I think they're definitely influencing actual flow of work. And I think, we'll come to it in a minute, but the whole world of AI, is influencing lots of things that we're all doing. And again, this is the buzz conversation in everything, really. And you can everything, not only work, but it's life, really, isn't it? It's a part of life. So, but it's interesting seeing how that's affecting the professions in some ways.
It's if we include COVID, and let's say over the next 5 years, we've got the adoption of AI, and I do think it's gonna ramp up way faster than people think. If you look back 6 months to 12 months ago, no one really knew anything about it, and now it's heavily adopted. We're definitely in offices less. With the adoption of AI, I think we are gonna need less people to do the same volume of work. There's no doubt about that. So it almost streamlined the commercial space even more. But then it's about, okay, great. If we've got individuals, it doesn't matter what your profession is, that wants to sit at a computer and use AI, that's one thing. Yeah. But as you said, you can do that on your dining room table. So what are we bringing you into the office for? Is it collaboration? And is AI going to increase or reduce collaboration? Because I'd say currently it's more of a solo activity in terms of how it's being used. And I think, and maybe that's the space. Maybe that's it's how we take AI in its current form and we ensure that it's used in a collaborative use case across a business, and then how we drag that into the office. Because I still think, I learned as I was growing up, as you would have done, as lawyers do. You're sitting in a large open plan office with, and you get given a seat with more experienced people either side of you. Yeah. And you learn by osmosis. And whether that's listening to people talking on the phone, or, I can still remember our senior partner walking around the office dictating letters on a dictaphone, but you're listening and you're absorbing that. I think, it's that's what the guys and girls coming up through the ranks don't necessarily have. So that's why I think there's definitely a place for the office. But it's in my view, it's not about trying to make it just a nice, comfortable place to work. It's about ensuring that the right people are in that office to allow people to learn from other people.
I do agree that it's interesting the way that there was a conversation for a while about not sure what the sort of need for an office would be in central London, or what the shape for it would be, and would it be just a hub and people would still be majoritively working from home. It's interesting how that's turned on its head, because actually, if you look at the trends for most of the lease take up almost over the last year, a lot of people have significantly taken a lot more than they had. So the growth in actual area take is saying, well, actually we're finding we want the office, but I often wonder whether utilization is always marrying with that additional space take. It's quite interesting.
And is it they're taking additional space because they're not occupying it in the same densities that they would have done 5 years ago? It's now actually, we need to take more space because of the additional areas that we're providing, within that space.
Or whether they're anticipating just growth, and actually at a certain point in time, we know that everyone's going to want to be back with each other. But I have seen a notable increase in maybe in the last 6 months of a certain amount of, you will have noticed it's being on the trains seems to be the trains are busier again. And even though they say that it's a relatively consistent travel pattern, that might be more about the still Mondays and Fridays are quiet in town, but the other days, but maybe the middle days are very, very busy with people. So the offices are busy, and there's the utilization has, say, gone from 60% up to 80% on those days when those offices. So people are making the effort to come in, and it's interesting how it didn't really affect BDG that much, COVID, because it was already very mobile anyway. They'd sort of almost like 10 years ago, they'd set a new strategy with everyone being mobile, everyone working from lockers. So, and they were very relaxed about where you worked from. So it had quite a forward-thinking business. So COVID didn't hugely affect that, which is quite interesting. Obviously, no one could be together in a building, but it was already quite a nimble business in the way it operated. It was already using cloud computing, so it was didn't rely on any servers in any physical space. So it was impressive. So there's some good projects with quite a few big public brands in that time. We worked for Sony Pictures, did some great work for Dojo, Nike, Google, Tate and Lyle. So again, this was interesting. Some really interesting public brands. After my time at Gensler, which did have brands, BDG suddenly had very, very lively brands. And actually, we did work with Acrylicize on a few of those projects. And again, that was great because it was really exciting to work with people that had the pinpoint sharpness of the environmental branding that Acrylicize and others do. But it was these are the sort of companies that actually want to work with companies like that, where they've got an appetite to say, well, our brand can't be misrepresented, and we need a really good narrative and storytelling process in our workplace where we're marrying our brand with our physical build. And that was great. So we had lots of these projects that they had these sort of really diverse and storytelling type schemes with loads of sort of built-in innovation, and a lot of that was coming in after COVID as well, where we had suddenly lessons have been learned. Suddenly there was loads of new kit for having meetings and virtually collaborating with people, and suddenly there seemed to be a little bit of an evolution at that time about how people were prepared to meet as well. It wasn't just a table anymore. It was different types of settings, but often involving AV as well, which all seemed quite new. So almost like sofa rooms, which would be like a lounge, which was suddenly like a little bit resonating with having meetings from home in COVID. And when you were having to work from home, there was some things that comfort was like, okay, I really like that. I like having a meeting sitting in a sofa. It doesn't have to be in a sort of, in a typical meeting room. And we found a lot of clients quite, resonated and liked that. The job we did for Dojo had this sort of resi-mercial feel, which was a very home from home type scheme, this big, industrial building, which was the Brunel building by Fletcher Priest. And then we put Sony and Dojo both into that building, and they both had different types of foregrounds. So Sony was very telling stories about what they did, their process, filmmaking, TV, games, all sorts of things. And Dojo was a lot more about this, very interesting sort of foreground, which was built around, a residential feel, sitting in front of all of this concrete and sort of pretty, well designed and beautiful Cat A, but very industrial looking. And we worked with a fantastic residential designer on that one called Stefan Tolgard, who again, it was another unusual collaboration, like a residential designer working with, a commercial office designer. But the output was great. It was a 1+1 = 3, and it really enjoyed that one. So I'm all about that sort of thing. I really like collaborations with sort of not unexpected people, because I think you always get results which you just do not expect it, and you might think it's going to be very different, but it suddenly turns into a solution that is very relatable. And ultimately we're all designers coming from slightly different angles.
That's interesting. So how did that work from a management of that perspective? So two different design firms on one job.
Yeah.
Resi
Yeah.
bias, workplace bias. Was it a case of, there was workplace was design lead, and the residential designer fed into the overall workplace piece, or was it two separate work streams kind of coming together? And how did that work?
So Stefan, who was the residential designer, he was more like a consultant to us than he didn't produce any information. He just came in once a week, and we had a really almost old-fashioned design workshop with him, which sometimes lasted 3 hours, where we would be there marking up drawings, drawing together. It was very much analog over digital, so it was a lot of just working together on tracing paper, and then we'd work things through proportions, detail, materiality, sometimes the storytelling, sometimes the outcomes. And he'd always have an interesting sort of perspective on how something might be operated on, but he'd also be very happy to learn from us in the same way. So we both had different experiences on how people would use space. And his background is not only residential; it's also it's also elements of hospitality and restaurants. So I do think there's a lot to be learned from these sort of collaborations. And the same way, actually, even collaborating with someone like a Criticize, they know what they want to do in terms of their story, but they also love working with something that's going to be a collaborative output. So I think it's exciting for me that process is, and I long encourage working with artists and different types of designers. I'd love to work with an industrial designer. I've always been a massive fan of industrial design, so all of the greats like Data Rams and Mark Newson. I'd love to sort of work with someone on somewhere within a workplace project. I don't know how it would be, but I just think there's again there's a really interesting sort of perspective with things that you can pick up and take. I don't know where that would come into a workplace project. I suppose it already does in terms of furniture and workstations and things like that. But I think there's something else there that I don't know can be found, and also sensory design as well. I think that I'd love to work with a sensory designer. Maybe even I often think that music or sound is another frontier within a workspace that no one's really properly explored. If you think about it within a museum or something, you go in there, it's part of an experience, is sound. It doesn't have to be music, it can be soundscape, something that's defining your emotion.
Defining the different zones that you're walking through, or as opposed to now we have, are the acoustics good, and do we need white noise?
Yeah, it's true. That's very true, and I think it's been underplayed. I actually went to one project the other day, which was it was a big science occupier in central London, and I got in there, and there was a sound that's clearly had been curated for this, and it was quite an ethereal sound. There was a huge, great big AV installation which almost had wheat blowing away in over this huge field, and I thought, wow, that's a fantastic experience to enter into that. The sound, which is non-music but emotional, and then this incredible vision. I think that's something that there should be more of. So it's something you never know.
I'm not a designer. That's not my that's not the way that my brain thinks. But I could appreciate that. If you've got your team walking through a reception foyer to come into work, and you have the ability to almost inspire them and change their, because they might have had a crap start to the day at home. No one knows what's coming from home. To kind of almost have a reset as you're walking through that reception space from an experience perspective, and reframe the way that you think. So by the time you sit down to start collaborating, you're ready to go.
Yeah.
That's
We had
that's
one client at Gensler who was a fashion client, and they had a signature scent in their reception area within their workplace, but that was their brand scent. So when you arrived in, there was aromatifiers secretly, you couldn't see them, but you straight away. It's like when you go to a hotel chain or something, and they have that. But this was a commercial workplace, but they were giving the same brand experience. And I think again, that's something that it's just another sensory step that I think that people will appreciate. And I know I've arrived. I'm not just looking at a brand and a logo. I'm actually having a feeling here of resonating with this brand. So I think there's lots of areas to explore there, and I find these sort of frontiers, really exciting. And I hope they take some footing somewhere in the world. And I know there are clients that, as we become more and more aware, especially emotions, and the way that lifestyle does really blend in now with work and the sort of marriage that is happening there, I think some of these things will sort of become more and more intertwined. But I did, I left it. I left BDG earlier this year. And it was a lot of talented people. I feel lucky to have worked on the projects with some of those people. It was a great team. It was very together. It was very, very social. It was like a proper design studio, getting in the mornings. In fact, and when I was doing the MD role, I was almost one of the first people in every day, and often one of the last to leave. And I'd be doing everything from looking at the payroll down to putting the peanuts out and the fruit out for all the staff for the first thing in the morning. So it was a very, it was a small business, but we did everything to sort of to keep it moving, and it was very, innovative and design driven. And I think that time, it will go down as a great part of my career, just because even though I think there's lots of very interesting episodes, especially what happened with COVID. But I think that the projects we delivered, were really, really interesting. And all of those people, they all played their part in its success. There were so many people that sort of really sort of continually stepped up week by week on making sure that, that what we were outputting was, the best it could be. So I did, when I left, so I had a little bit of time out for a bit. And I probably did a little bit of evaluation, sort of 10 weeks out, which was interesting to have that.
But a soul
And
searching.
it was a bit of soul searching. It's kind of like good to reflect as well. It's interesting sort of seeing the times have changed. I mean, I guess I did think a little bit about over my career, what the big changes that I've had in terms of workplace. And I was trying to almost doing a little bit of assessment of what's going to be next, but not completely. I mean, I'd probably just when we first started. Well, one of the big sea changes in the world of workplace was probably when mobile and Wi-Fi came along, and then we suddenly everyone had laptops and phones. And then with cloud computing came along next, and it was a big sort of process of everyone moving into agility. And then within COVID, suddenly hybrid working took footing, and that was a big buzzword. And even though probably the principles of hybrid working weren't that new, they were been there for a lot of companies for years. But they were still, it was anchored onto a buzzword, and everyone said this is the new way of working. And now we're into sort of the world of AI. And I often, I think about, like I said, how this is going to be affecting some of the big professions like accounting and law. I even think it's interesting the way it's affecting other professions as well, like science. It's interesting how robotics are now doing huge amounts of actual science experimenting in labs where people used to do those. And there's other areas of tech as well where we've got more development of AI and robotics. But I find all of that very interesting. But Woody, so where does this play its part in what the next generation of workplace is going to need? What is it going to carry on needing? And I think some of the things that came out of COVID are still playing their part in this. And I still think, every business still needs to be a heart of the business, really. Wherever your business is, it's still got to be that central place where everyone feels like they've got to go into. And whether it's a regional heart or a central London heart, that's still the place where, the social capital is really going to happen. The togetherness of people to people, that's probably going to be where the best technology is based in the business rather than being on a laptop. And that's where your brand is really celebrated and and anchored. and that's probably where all your culture is cited as well. And also probably having representation for certain businesses. You can't misrepresent it by never being there. You've got to represent the business, either being part of your network or being in London around your industry, or you've also got to be there representing yourself within a business. So I think that there's lots of elements there which I think are still really playing their part, but I still think there's evolution happening that will continually happen, that's based around human needs, and also probably the needs of ever-changing work. But I think AI is going to play its part in this. I do think it's going to. I think it's going to carry on saying, as you said, I think the machine learning process of AI, where we're at now. I remember having this conversation with someone quite recently, and they said that if you're looking at the evolution of AI and the speed that it moves at, we're probably almost like we're the caveman stage now. If you look at that, the traditional of sort of person sort of slowly learning how to walk, we're at that stage, but it learns so quickly. And an example is like the chess computers that that years ago, I think it was probably maybe even over only 5 years ago, there wasn't a chess computer. The chess computers were just about beating the human players. Now, something like the 20 best chess computers in the world best players in the world are all computers. And beyond that, now the best AI-driven chess computers now beat all of the other standard chess computers easily. And like there was I think there's one famous, might be even it's a DeepMind computer, DeepMind chess computer. I forget what it's called, but it beats the previous Google standard non-AI chess computer in 20 matches. I think it won something like 17 of them, and they drew the other 3. But it only learned how to play chess the day before it won all that series, because it machine learned how to play chess like a grandmaster in a very short space of time. And that's incredible. So if it's doing that with chess, what can it do with industry? And I think that sort of steep, sharp curve of evolution of AI we are going to see that move suddenly really, really quickly. And it might be moving that quickly in the background, but it just hasn't been exposed to human society and industry yet. But I believe there's lots of amazing benefits that we can take from it. And I'm even I'm gobsmacked by what I see some of the AI tools doing with even visualization and things in that comes out of work that we're doing. How quickly. I remember we did a pitch quite recently on something, and when we actually found an image of an old desolate site down in the Oval, which is an old industrial site. It's like a Victorian photograph of this. There's like a union meeting in this site in the Oval, and we managed to put it through a system, and then suddenly it animated it into this town hall meeting with all these union people moving, and it turned into an 8-second animation. Now I know that's possible, but it looked absolutely compelling. And I know that's just an AI system working a process and using an algorithm to make an image move, there's lots of platforms that are doing this now. But I was just staggered by how convincing it looked. And it
I think across any sector, just architecture maybe particularly, if used right, it can become a tool to help take clients on a journey, a storytelling journey, but also, whereas before perhaps there was an element of faith from the client, okay, look, we kind of believe what you're telling us, but we have faith in you that you're right. You have the ability now with the data, with AI, to almost prove ahead of time that the story that you're trying to sell to a client is not fiction, and we can bring you on that journey very quickly. And it's the same for QSing. It's just, I think it's I struggle to find a sector or a profession where it's not going to be of benefit. I think the key is going to be it's the people that excel with it are the ones that adopt it early, trial and error, and B become almost prompting experts. It's about knowing how to get the best out of a tool as well as knowing what the tools are, because there's an endless amount already.
funny. My children are both quite anti-AI. So I've done a few times. I've made a birthday card or something for my wife, which is where I've tried to feed it an information. It's generated an image, which has been sometimes hit and miss, but still trying it out. But they're obviously a younger generation. I don't know what the generation title of a 17-year-old is, but she says, my daughter India will say, Dad, you know that using AI is bad for the environment. And every time you get it to do something like that, it makes a data center work hard for you. And if the whole world's doing that, then we can't afford it. And it's funny how, and I'm quite fascinated how, there is some rejection, but that's not the rejection I would have thought I know sustainability will be a question, of course, but it's still the awareness at that level seems to be quite acute, and I was quite surprised. But
And I suppose
anyway,
it's what media, and what sort of news sources that generation are listening to. Like, for example, whether they're not yet being taught it in school.
yeah,
And I think there's a whole this different pod, but we're still being taught in school how we were taught 10, 20, 30 years ago, maths,
yeah,
English, science, learning to pass a test, and then off you go into the real world. And that's when you actually start to learn.
yeah,
In reality, if we want our children to come into the workplace ready to, whether you agree or don't agree with AI, but ready to utilize it, that needs to be taught far earlier in the process.
I agree. I really
and
do
I think
agree.
there's a fear now that children, maybe if they get taught about it, are just going to use it for their homework or for their coursework. But that exists. That's and arguably, different debate, is that wrong? If you've got a tool that can help you solve a problem correctly, better, faster, should you not be using that? But that's not a construction, real estate, London offices.
I know. We'll save that one for another day. But
yeah, that's for the pub.
I've now I've joined Hawkins Brown. This was coming up to 4 months ago. I feel lucky to have joined them. I mean, I've always had a lot of admiration for them. I've loved their work. I've always thought their ethos is really, really good. Really authentic, and they've always believed and stuck to their guns to what they've all been about. It's always been about people, life, user focus. People actually using spaces, using different parts of society. Society as a whole is a big thing for them. I've always thought they've had a fresh approach to workplaces. They haven't been huge in the workplace market. They've done the projects, but they've never really sort of hugely shouted. They've done lots of great work within buildings for tenants, but they've never really sort of done huge amount on publishing and hunting down the workplace world. But they have lots of experience in it. So I straight away knew that, okay, this is great. If there was an opportunity to work for Hawkins Brown, I would love that opportunity to happen. And I like the way that they really focus on the whole of work within a whole joined up life. So they have lots of people that work within residential, different parts of society, town planning, master planning, different types of commercial buildings, residential. I think all of that it combines into sort of the fabric of life, which I think is really an interesting perspective to see the whole thing from. I think they hear a huge amount of intelligence and research that goes into their projects, so they try and be very innovative, very data-led. I've always respected anything that's data-led. I think it has to come that way, and just a real high value on innovative creativity. And for me, that's very important. I've always been a design-led person. It's a big part of what I've had to do. No matter what role I've been doing, I've always never ever lost my love for design and pushing things forward. So for me, just very excited. They've been so welcoming. I felt at home on day one. I think I'm just slowly trying to remember everyone's name still, but I think I'm halfway around the studio with it. Broadly everyone on first name terms now. So but yeah, it's Russell Brown and Roger Hawkins. They're still both very inspirational people to have around the office and see every day. And then there's a whole generation of people behind them that really are fantastic leaders in each of their sectors. So I'm looking forward to trying to contribute into lots of different parts of the business. focus is going to be workplace and fit out projects. But I'm very excited for 2026.
So what's your kind of, in terms of, if you're looking at interiors, what's, and it might be too early for you to have a plan, but, if we look at the next 1, 2, 3 years, what's your focus? What's getting you out of bed in the morning? What are you trying to achieve over that next period?
Well, firstly, I need to work on establishing Hawkins Brown into probably the world of workplace, as far as being considered and working more with occupiers and tenants. So that's, and how we can sort of take some of our design ethos into tenant thinking more than we have done to date. Because I think there's some of the projects that we do, like for instance, Here East is a fantastic project over in East London in Stratford. We're working currently on the redevelopment of Printworks over in Surrey Quays, and they're both very progressive approaches on buildings which are almost industrial buildings that are being repurposed into workplaces. So the term we use is industrial rehab, and I think that there's a massive place in the market for that, and that's also including retrofitted buildings. But I think that, where I can come into the process is to start looking at things maybe a little bit more from an early point strategically, from an occupier advisory, maybe looking at buildings as a whole. But I think sort of some of it is also, for me, the design language that Hawkins Brown has always had. I've always thought that's got a wider audience if it wants it, that can be taken really successfully into sort of large scale workplace projects. Because I think the work we've done, a lot of it has sort of been for local authorities. We've done work for lots of different entities of government, and I think the output is really strong. But I'd love to sort of marry some of these high-tech industrial rehab buildings and take that language inside into other buildings. And I think that's a very exciting prospect to have. I also think there's a really high value on sustainability at Hawkins Brown, which I've also found fascinating. Some of their systems I think are brilliant. And I think where we can introduce that into workplaces, and I don't think it means savings, but I think it often is going to mean, new aesthetics to projects, using sort of much forward-thinking methodology to construction that does have sustainable roots. But I think all of that is also very, very exciting. So I think, there's lots I want to offer. I think that I'm lucky to have walked into a very talented team. The interiors team is around 20 people, and of all different types of roles, ranging from people that can do strategy to design, delivery. And I think I feel very privileged to suddenly have this team, and also working with the great Morag Morrison, who's been running the team for 30 years. And she is a fantastic, really great influence, and an incredible designer herself. So yeah, it's I feel lucky that lucky days are ahead. So, and I'm really looking forward to sort of delivering some great project work with this team.
Fantastic. And I know people can't see your face because we're not a video podcast, but seeing you talk about it, you are lit up, which is always nice to see. Look, Matt, I know we said we didn't know how long this was going to take, but it's an hour and a half has absolutely flown by.
Sorry, I feel like I hope I haven't spoken too much,
well,
Steve.
Not at all. It's that's why I love this. We start with a simple question, and it just flows. And it's everyone says it's like free therapy, and I enjoy it. I always say that I know you better now than I ever would had we gone and grabbed lunch. And the nice thing is that now everyone else listening can also knows you better. But look, thanks ever so much for coming on. Let's catch up. Obviously, we can catch up in person, but let's try and get you back on the pod in a year or so's time, and we can catch up on your new chapter and how things are going.
I really enjoyed it. It's been nice talking to you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Matt.
All right, take care. Thanks again, Steve. Bye.
If you have an office project on the horizon and will be preparing a budget for board approval, head to my website, www.steveberridge.com, where I have a collection of resources to help you formulate a robust project budget and give your project the best chance of being a success. Thanks.